Hey, I'm here with Elizabeth Nolan Brown at Reason. She is an associate editor at reason.com right here on Connecticut Avenue, just north of DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for having me and taking the time today.
Thank you for having me on.
So what exactly is an associate editor?
Well, I don't know. In the magazine world, sort of everyone's an editor, kind of. It's like a print magazine convention still. So
okay.
Reason is still also a print magazine, so our titles are kind of like that.
I saw some amazing covers downstairs. I mean, how long they're up on the wall, like from the 70s, like from the 80s even, like the DEA, the real enemy of the drug war. Like how long has Reason been around?
Reason actually is just celebrating its 50th anniversary this year.
No kidding.
Yeah, so it's very exciting. We had a big gala in LA, and
awesome.
There's the guy who founded it is still involved. He does transportation policy, and he's got this whole transportation policy groupies. I think it's There's
groupies.
There's people for every subject. So.
That is definitely true.
I just found out today though that the Libertarian Party is only 47 years old. They just tweeted happy birthday to us, 47th, and I was shocked. I thought it was older, and also I'm like, wow, Reason is older than the Libertarian Party.
Wow, Reason might have kicked that off officially in some way then back then. Who knows? And how long have you been at Reason?
I've been here almost 5 years now.
That's awesome. What were you doing before that? And are you a card carrying libertarian, or are you just a writer for a libertarian newspaper?
I like to say, and a lot of people here at Reason say the same thing, that we're small L libertarians, which means, we believe in the libertarian philosophy, but we aren't necessarily members of the Libertarian Party.
Got it.
We're not angling for Libertarian Party candidates. I mean, not that we're opposed to them either, but, that's kind of just... our editor always likes to say politics is downstream of culture, that quote. So, it's...
And who said that quote?
I actually do not know who originally said that.
I'm pretty sure it was Andrew Breitbart.
Was it really?
Yeah.
I thought it was someone before him. He
was
just
it?
Like to quote it too.
Oh, did he? I don't know.
All right.
That would be funny, though, wouldn't it? That's funny. Okay, yeah. Well, politics is definitely downstream from culture, and I would argue that college campuses are upstream from culture, and that's why I like to spend a lot of time on college and think about that place quite a bit. But tell me, how did you come to Reason? What were you doing before that? I like to just give a little bit of background for people because these interviews are not just about the subject matter, but about the people behind the work, and so I'm interested to hear what brought you to writing for Reason.com.
Yeah. I think it's kind of good to, you'll appreciate this, having taken a sort of a roundabout way to writing and path to getting involved in things like that. Because, I've been a writer and a journalist for my whole career pretty much, but I've been all over the place sort of within that sphere.
Yeah.
I started at a legal newspaper in Columbus, Ohio, right after college. And then I came here to a seminar for the Institute for Humane Studies. And it was about classical liberalism.
Got it.
And this was in D.C., and it was funded by the Koch brothers. So I like to say that, I went to Koch brainwashing camp.
Nice. Have you been able to shake that yet?
It was great, though, because what happened was I didn't really know much about libertarianism or classical liberalism, but it wasn't like they, convinced me of things that I didn't believe. It was like, oh my gosh, this is what I believe, and there's a word for it. Because I used to think that I was too liberal for the Democrats in some ways, but then also not enough. I knew I wasn't a Republican, but so finally it was like, oh, this is what I am. So and I also discovered that there's this whole weird world in DC of think tanks and nonprofits and things where people just get paid to write and think. It's like being a college professor without the students. And I was like, I want to do that, or I want to do PR for one of those, because I also learned that PR gets paid a lot better than journalism.
Oh yeah, because the PR's job is to withhold information, restrict information, and journalism's job is to free
people
information.
want to pay you for withholding information.
Right, exactly. It's more lucrative. It's worth more to people.
Yeah, so I applied to grad school, and I came here to American University. It was just a 1-year program in strategic communications, which was kind of communication theory, but also very practical. We had people from all these, working in DC come and talk to us. And so I did that, and it was great, and it was valuable because it got me out of Ohio and it got me to DC. And I started hanging out at Reason Magazine and with libertarian groups in DC at that time. This was a long time ago. This was 2006. And but I learned that I didn't want to go into PR at all. So that was also, I guess,
Right. Learning
That
what you
was-
don't want to do
Yeah.
is even more valuable. You got to like pare it down. Well, we're in like some really cool offices. I mean, this is not like a super fancy Mass Ave think tank kind of place. It's not real glossy. It's just kind of like pretty cool upstairs in DuPont Circle. And they've got a TV studio in here and a podcast studio and stuff. There's actually some really funny lizard-headed policemen in here. I don't know what's going on in the Reason offices, but it looks like fun. It looks like a lot of fun, actually.
It is a lot of fun.
That's cool. So, all right. So, did you work on like your school newspaper? Did you always want to be a writer? Did you know that when you were growing up?
I mean, I did. I didn't know what kind of writer. I was like, like dictating short stories to my babysitters and stuff. And like, I created a newspaper for my family where the news was like, it's someone's birthday.
Well, that's so. Yeah. So the answer is yes.
Yes, but I did all sorts of writing. I studied. My major in undergrad was playwriting. So I was a theater major with a playwriting and directing emphasis. So I thought I was going to do more creative writing. But then I also like.
But then you realize I have to feed myself.
Yeah, and I didn't. I mean, I still have friends who are doing theater, and they are still working second jobs in order to fund
Right.
their passion, and that's
Right.
amazing. But I was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to like do some crap job all day and then try to find time to write in my spare time or whatever.
Right. So I just interviewed Art Tavana, and he told me he had a similar experience of working in PR, and then he came to this realization. He's like, well, I can either be the writer I want to be, or I can make money. But he's actually continued to do his sort of passion work all at the same time. And I have this other friend. His name is Delicious Tacos, and he just released a another fiction novel. And he's just a tremendous writer. But he's also finding the same difficulty, which is following your passion in creative writing is often not necessarily the most lucrative way to go. Yeah.
And luckily, I mean, I love doing journalism too. So it's not like
Yeah.
this was like, it was just like, how do I make money from writing? And it was like, I actually love this. So
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just a long-winded, just to finish off my how did I get here? Right after I got an internship in while I was in grad school because I was an assistant to a baby boomers scholar. Like
my
he wrote
goodness.
about baby boomers.
Oh, fascinating.
So through that, I got an internship at the AARP magazine in their publications department. Wound up launching their first Twitter account. I helped them migrate from pretty much just doing print stuff to doing web stuff. So I was then at the AARP. They let me actually move. I moved to Brooklyn. They let me work from home. So I worked for the AARP for 5 years.
Doing social media for senior citizens.
Doing web production and stuff like that, and some writing and editing and all sorts of journalism. But yeah,
So you're the reason everybody's grandma's on Facebook now?
Don't blame me for that.
It's over when
They got on. This was a little before all the grandmas got on Facebook.
Okay. That's all that's left now.
And then I went to then for a few years to doing some health writing for like women's blogs and some kind of weird lifestyle blogging and things like that.
Yeah, I saw a tweet of yours the other day that said something about remembering what it was like to be a daily lifestyle blogger. And now you're like a deep dive investigative journalist on one hand, and at the same time you're also doing daily roundups of news and political stuff. So why don't you just talk a little bit about what you do generally, and then we've got a whole list of issues that I'd like to dig into.
A reason I now do a morning newsletter for us, which is just sort of focused on the big stories of the day from a little bit of a libertarian perspective. It's sort of a work in progress because we're trying to figure out it's kind of hard to know exactly what that looks like, how much we should. This is kind of an ongoing thing with libertarians in general, and reason I think is just like how much we should be paying attention to the main story of the day or stories of the day and reacting to it, and how much we should be sort of not buying into these other like frames and things.
Right,
and
because someone else is setting the narrative
right,
pace.
and try to draw attention to our own stories and things. So it's always kind of a balance. But
Right. So you guys, just so everybody knows, you guys are a nonprofit.
Yes.
And so you're mission driven.
Yes.
Yeah. What's the mission?
To spread free minds and free markets.
Free minds and free markets.
Yeah.
That's good. Who could argue with that?
Yeah.
So there is a motivational tint to the work that you guys do, right?
Yeah, and I mean I love it because actually AARP was a nonprofit too. So I've worked at a lot of nonprofit journalism outlets, and I find that at least at Reason at the AARP magazine even they don't mess with your sort of as long as you're within a sort of realm, and you're not going to be working here if you're not within this general realm of ideas.
Right.
They don't mess with there's not a pressure, there's not a political pressure. We don't have them telling us our donors want this. They keep us very separate from that side of things, from the fundraising and development side of things, so that it's not sort of affecting our reporting. when I did work for sort of the women's blogs and it was in a corporate atmosphere, we got so much pressure from advertisers. There was this one time where the advertisers got mad that we had the word rape in headlines, and they were just like, you can't say rape in headlines. Like, we got that order. We were like, we wrote about like sexual assault issues all the time, and it was like,
and that's in like 10 women raped us, whatever.
Yeah.
You couldn't even say that.
Yeah, you couldn't even say it like at all. It was just like, because they were like, they don't like having their products like show up next to the word rape. So I mean, I feel like it's I really like working at a nonprofit, and it's really nice to be. We are obviously looking to get, traffic, and we are obviously looking for people to read and see our work. We also do videos because we want to spread our ideas, but it's not so much driven on just like you need to get clicks, and that's the bottom line.
Right, and every publication has its own bias.
Right,
and it's just you guys are honest and open about it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's admirable. And every human being has their own biases. And so when they're just out front and spoken, then that's legit. It's just when they're hidden,
right,
then that's the issue. So do you mind talking a little bit about the debate that you guys have between following the story of the day or versus like setting your own agenda? Because I think that's a really interesting question. We live in a world of narratives. Narratives are what control our minds. And if you can control the narrative, you can basically control people's minds. So being proactive versus reactive, how has that been playing out in your discussions? I mean,
and this is a thing that's maybe changed a little bit in the past few years, but so when I started at Reason, it was 2014, and it was the very brief Libertarian Moment, as deemed by the New York Times. And there was all this talk about Rand Paul being the front runner and all this stuff, and there was all this attention. And then when it didn't pan out, everyone's like, "Ha, how's that Libertarian Moment?" But
I think it's still going.
Well, yeah. So one of the things, none of us, that was everyone else's way. That was sort of the mainstream media and the people who wanted to taunt us' way of framing it, was that it was all about getting libertarians elected to politics or having more Republicans and Democrats that were elected adopt libertarian ideas and whatever. And that's not what that's clearly not happening. But the world is getting more libertarian, despite the fact that there's so many examples you can point to that aren't. There's also so many that are. I don't know about the whole world. I think I'm talking about the United States. But if you look around us, just things like with same-sex relationships or with marijuana legalization. Those are just two of the major ones. But there's all sorts of things where people are so much less conformist, so much more, into individual liberties than ever before. And so, like, on a cultural level, I think that people are, or at least until very recently, we're getting more and more libertarian. There's some weird stuff going on the past few years.
Well, I think all the cool kids are definitely leaning libertarian, that's for sure. And I think that's sort of like the unifying theme of people that I find that I relate to are people that believe in individual liberties. I always said that my platform, before I even understood what libertarianism was, I always said my platform was gays, guns, and drugs. Right? Like, do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anybody else or yourself in some terrible way. And then basically just, leave everybody alone. And I think that's, if there's sort of like a unifying center these days, from the extreme right to the extreme left, like in the middle, I think we're finding is like libertarian minded. Is libertarian, is that that's like a moderate middle ground now?
I know, it's weird, right? I kind of think of us as that, which is weird because, if I think of any individual position, I don't know. But I think that a lot of people out there, just regular people who aren't necessarily paying attention to politics, who aren't necessarily very tribal about it or just very clued into the daily thing of it. I think most people are very kind of have this, it's a very American ethos, right? This sort of like live and let live. And I don't know.
Well, I'd like to maintain it as being an American thing, right? It seems to be, the narratives and some of our politicians are definitely moving away from that, sort of in the more authoritarian direction, and definitely coercion in terms of what you see, think, feel, act, do, etc. But I didn't even know what libertarianism was, and then I ended up at George Mason for economics, and so I just sort of like fell backwards into the second most libertarian economics and public policy school in the country after University of Chicago. And that's where I learned about the sort of like real ideological libertarianism, which I think taken in its own way to extremes can be problematic, in and of itself. But at the same time, it definitely introduced me to the idea that, a market-based solutions for things seem to work out better than government-based solutions. So, at least the common strand of the people that I've been interviewing, and maybe that's a reflection of me, from Jeffrey Miller, he's definitely libertarian. And then speaking with Art Tavana, he's definitely, he calls himself a libertarian conservative. And definitely talking to you. And I'm excited about it because it seems to me that there's like an intellectual honesty in that space that's not exactly found in the other extremes, right or left.
Well, and there's also there's a path forward maybe that we don't see in a lot of our stuff today with the right and the left, who are very sort of all or nothing about the way they approach things. I mean, we get a lot sort of within the libertarian movement and within among conservatives. There's some people who think of reason as being this crazy left-leaning libertine, thing. And then on the left, there's amongst Democrats, there's this idea that we're very conservative and right. You always hear the right-leaning or the conservative Reason magazine.
Right.
And I think it's because, there is room for people with all of those views within libertarianism. Like,
right.
Libertarianism doesn't have a position on whether or not you should be like in a polyamorous commune, like not eating gluten and like, making like performance art for a living, or whether you should be like homeschooling your children out on the prairie of, Colorado and,
right.
going to church every day and not having dinner with people of the opposite sex or whatever. I mean,
right.
it's about creating a system where the government can't harm people, whichever one of those things they're going to do, or the government's so minimal in your life that there's room for all people to sort of find their version of the good
right.
without being prevented from it.
Right.
And so many people today, though, are just like so offended by that very concept that other people might be living in a way that they don't approve of and being allowed to do it without government intrusion, maybe, or maybe if not to that extreme, at least without shame, right?
Right.
It seems like it just is like, we need to comment on your lifestyle. And this is very much a new thing on the left that we're seeing a ton of, but it's always been a kind of thing with certain subsets of the right too. And so it's
definitely
feels like it's just so much more of it
right,
now.
Right, from right and the left.
Yeah.
I've been watching this woman, DC McAllister from The Federalist on Twitter lately. She's been going bonkers.
I don't think I know her.
Oh, yeah. She's got a pretty solid following, and she writes for The Federalist, and she's definitely right-wing, but she believes, this is where things get confusing, she believes, quote-unquote, don't meddle as her sort of policy positions, but she's been on this sort of rampage about anti-prostitution, anti-sex work. She's even like taken to like a whole campaign against this one woman who like on her Patreon sends nudes to her followers. Like, whatever, like do whatever you want.
Are you talking about Bridget
Yeah.
Fetisi? Yeah.
Yeah.
I do know who you're talking about now because I've seen Bridget, yes, talking about this woman going off on her.
Right, totally going off on her because this woman, Bridget, just elects to have a private business and other private individuals elect to be patrons of hers. And she's not even like actually being a prostitute, which would be fine with me. She's just sending pictures of her breasts, and like this woman is freaking out and moralizing all about it. And so like there's moralizing coming from all over the place. And what I'm looking for are people that are just going to sort of live and let live. That's my general philosophy. But talking about the sex work and stuff sort of brings me into like one of the things that I have on my list that I want to talk to you about. And you've been doing just a ton of work on this, and it's sort of like a really hot button issue, and that's an issue around human trafficking, sex workers, individual liberties, the right for people to engage in kind of whatever work that they want to engage in, and it's a real sensitive button because people who are, I think, uninformed or even ill-informed on the matter hear the word sex trafficking and immediately think about just little kids getting pushed into slavery and sex slavery. And then they immediately, it seems to me, lose all sense of rational thought and reasonable thinking on the matter. And then and just are like, okay, like whatever you want to do, like, we got to save the children. And so it's actually much more complicated and complex than that. What do you know? Imagine that. And so that's something that you've been working on quite a bit. And the thing that I love about this podcast is I'm interested in what you're interested in and what your work has been about. So I want to give you a chance to really sort of talk about how you got into working on this subject, what the key issues are, and sort of what your take on all this is, because it's a really important one today.
Yeah. So I guess I kind of say my main coverage area is sort of the intersection of sex, speech, and civil liberties. I started, I'd always been interested just in sex worker rights and things like that. And so when I started here at Reason, I was, going to write about, I'd written, before about dumb taxes, sin taxes on strip clubs and things like that, and just sort of different sex worker rights movements. And it was just kind of focusing on that, the very libertarian thing, like people should be able to do what they want, with their bodies, consenting adults, as long as they're not harming anyone, and
Right.
between adults they should be allowed. Consent is the key.
Consent, of course.
But as I was starting to write about that, it was just, you couldn't write about that. You couldn't write about any of that stuff without coming across sex trafficking. Because suddenly it's become, and this has been a thing that's been brewing for like 15 or more years now, but suddenly it really, really picked up in around 2010 to, or after that. So by 2014, when I was starting at Reason, it was just like anything that had to do with sex. There was people talking about sex trafficking, saying that it was going to lead to sex trafficking, and proposing why we need to shut down anything like having to relate with adults and sex because of sex trafficking.
Right.
And so, so I started sort of, trying to dig into things, first starting with the numbers behind it. And, it turns out that there's just been so much crazy inflation and made up things with statistics when it comes to this stuff. And if you actually look at, what real numbers we do have, it's ridiculously smaller than the picture. And all the data that they do have is very... and like just for one example, there's this statistic that goes all around all the time about how 300,000 kids a year are being sex trafficked in the United States or at risk of being sex trafficked. And it turns out it's from this one study that wasn't peer reviewed in like 2001. And the author counted anybody who lived in public housing, anybody who had a divorced parent, anybody who'd like all these different things as at risk for sex trafficking. If they had more than one factor, he counted them twice or three times and then added all of them up. And then that's where they came from this number. And both him and these like national children's groups have been like, please don't use this statistic. It's wrong. It doesn't come from anywhere.
Oh, even the guy that made up the stat?
The guy disavowed it. He's just like, no, this was a bad study. Like, so, but it's
and we
still
see
just,
that quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
Like even with the rape on campus numbers.
Oh yeah.
Even like some of those original studies, the authors have come out and said like, this is not nationally representative. It was just a survey. Like, please don't take these numbers seriously. And even the implicit association test guy, the bias guy, he's even said that his test doesn't like accurately predict bias, but yet somehow all these statistics get used. It's like telephone, right? It gets said once and then it gets mutated again and then again and again. It never dies. It's like zombie stats, and then it makes its way into government policy. But before we get into that, can you just give like a working definition of what sex trafficking means?
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah, I should probably just back up and say, real quick, when people talk about sex work, that's usually sort of a broad category that includes both legal and illegal things. Everything from people who are working at strip clubs and doing legal sort of, sexy photos or pornography to people who are, engaging in sexual services for money. Prostitution, or what we would call prostitution. Sex trafficking, theoretically, I mean, when people hear about it, they think of the worst sorts of things. They think of people being abducted. They think of people being held against their will. Under federal definition of sex trafficking, anyone who is under 18 is defined as a sex trafficking victim if they get paid for sex or if anyone offers them money for sex. So there doesn't have to be any force, fraud, or coercion involved.
Got it. So like a girl who lies about her age on Tinder, she's 17, goes on there, she's 18, she says, send me $5 Venmo and I'll send you like a topless nude. She's a sex traffic victim?
Yes.
Got it.
Yes, 100%. And that's actually like the bulk of the people that they prosecute in federal courts are stories like that. Technically, if you're an adult, then there does have to be an element of force, fraud, or coercion involved. But that's very dicey, and especially while that might be actually true when it comes to federal charges, that's not at all how they use it in the media. I mean, this started sort of at the federal level, and it's seeped down to local news and local cops, and now pretty much, I mean, if you look at any headline across the country and you see human trafficking operation or sex trafficking operation in Sting, and then you look at what it says, it'll always say that they arrested a bunch of people for prostitution, maybe they arrested a bunch of customers, maybe they arrested the sex workers themselves, maybe they arrested one or two people for being a pimp, which is, taking money from someone who is in prostitution. It doesn't necessarily involve violence. It can, they can be bad.
It's like
pimps.
being a manager.
Yeah. I mean, there really are though, because sex workers complain that anybody who helps them out does get charged with, now they say they'll call them sex traffickers. So if someone drives them and acts as a bodyguard, they can get charged. And
for even like an adult.
Yeah.
You're driving an adult woman to meet with an adult customer.
Yeah.
And all you're doing is driving the woman to her sex work gig.
Yes.
And then you're now a human trafficker, a sex trafficker?
I mean, it depends, what the charges are specifically, but yes, that's how they do these operations. You'll look and they'll say, we arrested this many people for pimping and related crimes or sex trafficking and related crimes. And then you read the stories and it's, it's very often anybody who is with the person. And obviously, like, I'm not naive, I don't think that everybody who's working in sex work just has this great relationship with and is just, totally there by choice. Obviously, there are bad pimps out there and bad people who are, taking advantage of people and exploiting them. But also, there are very good reasons why someone who is in prostitution, especially at a sort of lower end level and is meeting people off of, internet ads and going to hotels, why they would want someone to be with, like, especially a guy, who's big and can protect them and can wait out in the car and make sure nothing goes wrong, or to do that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's not always an exploitative situation, but it's always treated like that.
Right. So where do you think this hysteria came from? I mean, I use hysteria. Is it a hysteria?
I think it's definitely a hysteria
real?
because
so what is the point, and who's winning from this, and how does it play itself out in our national dialogues and in our laws? And then what are the negative side effects?
Yeah. So where this came from is really, there was sort of, it's really fascinating, actually. There's this paper that has all these quotes from these people when they were passing the first anti-sex trafficking federal law in 2000. And there were pretty much three coalitions. There was a sort of human rights coalition that was just like, we want to deal with global issues. We want to make sure we're giving enough U.S. resources to stop sex trafficking abroad and whatever. And then there was a group that was kind of concerned with the bureaucracy, and they were like, we want to make sure we have the right, I don't even know what, weird federal grant categories so that we can get money to victims groups or domestic violence shelters and whatever within the United States. And then there was the coalition of sort of Christian conservatives and evangelical conservatives and radical feminists, the sort of anti-porn 80s, Catherine McKinnon style, Andrea Dworkin, very sex feminists. So they had sort of teamed up and been working on anti-porn stuff, and now they needed a new issue, and they settled on sex trafficking. They settled on being anti-prostitution, and there's actually all this stuff about them sort of talking and coming to the idea that most Americans at the time were even becoming more and more comfortable with the idea of legalizing or decriminalizing prostitution, and that in order to draw up support for these sorts of policies, they were going to have to reframe it as sex trafficking and reframe arresting the customers of it as ending demand for sex trafficking.
I see.
So it's sort of been a concerted strategy since then at various levels.
The radical feminists get involved, and they want to end access to sexual partners for men. Basically,
or they think that, or they're under some, the sort of silly, like, oh, by letting men pay for sex, then you're promoting an objectification of women. Or,
reinforcing the patriarchy.
Right, exactly. Just all that sort of bullshit. So.
I'd be remiss if I let this go without commenting that the radical feminists tend to want to sort of enforce the sex cartel. And like, it's a way of limiting sexual access for men, whether it's through pornography, prostitution, don't you dare masturbate, any of those things. And then you find this very strange alliance between the religious right and the hardcore sort of rightist people teaming up.
Yes.
With the radical feminists in order to shame people out of like individual actions and consensual sexual activities. Yeah,
when I say radical feminists, I don't mean just like really, really feminist. Like, it's a kind of specific sect of feminists or whatever. Like, I consider myself a feminist. There are all sorts of different kinds, but
definitely.
But so they combined and they started pushing this legislation. I mean, why it's bad is so many reasons. The ones that we've just been discussing is the fact that it catches up a lot of innocent people who are adults just trying to engage in consensual sexual activity and throws them into the criminal justice system and all sorts of horrible outcomes and records and, sometimes even registers as a sex offender and all sorts of stuff.
Right. And there's more, like, this adds an extra layer of prosecution on top of just solicitation and prostitution.
Right. They're ramping up the charges for these things because they're saying, well, now we're going after some people are like, ramp that, penalty up for, I mean, in Seattle, they even redefined soliciting prostitution as soliciting someone for sexual exploitation or something like that. Like, it says it in the name now.
It's exploitive no matter what.
Yeah. So it's, bad for sex workers, bad for people who want to pay for sex, or it's bad for sex trafficking victims. Because they're spending so much time, they're spending so much time doing this other stuff with the money that they're supposed to be using to try and help people who are actually in trouble.
Right.
And B, they are driving things deeper into the shadows with a lot of their policies. And there's a whole lot of different ways they're doing that. But the net effect is that it's made people less willing to, be customers less willing to be screened, people less willing to be communicating in open ways, and therefore both makes, it more likely for people to be exploited without anyone knowing, and harder for the cops to actually find them and, when people are in trouble. And then just at the larger level, though, there's all sorts of ways that it harms people just not at all connected to the sex industry or anything.
Okay.
Because you politicians have really learned over the past 15 years that they can use sex trafficking as a way to pass pretty much anything. And so there's been every 2 or 3 years these giant bills at the federal level and also various state houses. And they will tuck all sorts of stuff into it, all sorts of sort of civil liberties infringements and various things into it, in terms of sort of regulating the internet, in terms of, sort of surveillance and creating, giving government permission to do warrantless wiretapping on things and various things. And so there's just been a whole, and, as a result of this too, I mean, one of the most recent examples is FOSTA. We can get into that in a second, but it's sort of resulted in people cracking down on speech and on images online just more broadly in a way that just affects the whole internet, just affects everybody, because they're so worried about running afoul of these sex trafficking laws that now they're just preemptively, banning all sorts of speech.
Right. And you mentioned FOSTA, and we're going to get to that. We're going to also get to social media and internet censorship and impingements on freedom of speech. But one thing I wanted to follow up on there was you mentioned that they're using, jurisdictions are using the guise of sex trafficking in order to sort of like pass bills and increase their budgets. Do you think that the false threat of sex trafficking has led in part to the militarization of the local police forces? Have they used this as a way to get more money and then ramp up their budgets and buy more equipment and get that leftover U.S. military gear? And it's not just like the guy walking down the street with his nightstick, like running it along the fences anymore. I mean, these are like heavily equipped, heavily armed, serious sort of military operations. I mean, are you seeing that as a result of this sort of madness?
I think most of that came from sort of the drug war, and then in the aughts, the like sort of terror budgets that police departments had. I don't think a lot of the militarization stuff came from this, but what I do see is two things. I mean, departments that hardly were doing any sort of vice stings at all before, then they get these grants to do sex trafficking stings, and which just turn out effectively as vice stings. So they're doing prostitution stings that they wouldn't before, but they also end up sweeping up just a ton of people. I mean, they arrest people for drugs, they arrest people for driving on an expired license, for having unpaid court fines. I mean, every time you look, there's dozens of people. So they sort of just use it as a dragnet to get anybody who's done anything wrong, and at a very petty level. These aren't like big criminals that they're catching. It's like unpaid court fines,
right.
And then also they work with Homeland Security and ICE and with the FBI and with the U.S. Marshals and all sorts of stuff on these anti-sex trafficking operations all the time. So they do end up very militarized in practice.
Right.
These sort of SWAT raids on hotel rooms. I mean, there's some footage of the FBI's Operation Cross Country, which is this big annual one online, and it's really disturbing to watch, because it's just this, gaggle of men in the SWAT gear busting into. There's a woman who looks like she's not even 18 years old, and underwear, boy shorts, and a tank top, and sitting on the bed crying, and they're busting in to arrest her after she just thought she was meeting a customer, and it's just
right.
It's very disturbing the way they handle this. I mean, it's very traumatizing the way that they treat these people who they're saying, well, we need to find out if they're victims, and then they often arrest them. And often they're not victims,
and then they make them victims.
Yeah, so it's it's.
I mean, obviously, we should just make it very clear that, like, in any instance of like a kid being transported and forced into sex work and stuff, we're obviously very adamantly opposed to that, and we really would like to see that taken care of. But what we're seeing, though, is like just a crazed overstatement of the case, totally inflated facts, using this as a weapon, as a way to go after, and we're going to get to even like the bigger picture issues, but as using it as a way to go after, just local people doing local things that we both, at least in our sort of libertarian perspectives, believe should be left to individual adults as to decide what's good for them.
But also, and it's, people will try to do this all the time too. Yeah. With me writing on this subject, try to say, oh, why do you care more about them than the victims? Why do you care more about these people? And it's like, I don't. I mean, I care about both, and I think that what we are doing actively harms the victims. I mean, especially just because we are not at all treating the people who need, finding the people who are need, because the people who actually end up sort of, coerced and forced into prostitution and even occasionally abducted and things like that, and this bad stuff. If they're underage, they tend to be foster children. It's like 75% of them come from foster care or state care. Because they're just, I guess, state care is so horrible in so many situations that they're just runaways. So they're just constantly running away. And also, when it comes to adults, it's usually a domestic violence sort of situation, or very frequently a domestic violence sort of situation, where the person thinks that they're in love with the partner, and then they're abusing them and taking advantage of them and taking their money and making them, work in prostitution, sometimes even if they don't want to. So those are serious problems, and I care about those things. And it's like, by focusing on this, imaginary, mythical idea of sex trafficking, we're not devoting any resources to those things. First and foremost, like figuring out what the heck is going on with state, care of children that are underage. Like, why is it so bad that the vast majority of people who are minors in the sex trade are supposed to be being taken care of by the government, and meanwhile they're just spending all their time arresting adult sex workers instead of figuring that out. It's just like
right. And a similar thing happens with the inflated campus rape statistics. What happens is it distracts from the real issue, and it harms actual victims. If everybody is a victimizer and everybody is a victim, then the people that are actually suffering from sexual violence are not getting the care, attention, or resources that they should get. So that's really what this is all about, right? Now, there are actual follow-on consequences to this that are even more impactful and more widespread. And so why don't we start talking about that a little bit? What has evolved out of this conversation and infused in some weird, mad, marriage, a mutated marriage, and resulted in basically like the end of free speech. Let's not get too dramatic, but we're on our way there. I mean, it's chipping away at it. So let's talk about FOSTA and get into Backpage and all that now.
Yeah, so FOSTA was a law passed last year in the winter or spring, and it had been in the works for a while in various forms, but they finally got it through. It was described a lot as being a law that makes it illegal to advertise sex trafficking victims online. That is not a thing that was legal before this law. It was not okay to actively advertise sex trafficking victims online before this. So, I mean, that's crap that this is what that law did. The federal government explicitly passed the law in 2015 to make it a crime at the federal level to advertise someone for sex trafficking if they're a victim of sex trafficking. What FOSTA actually did is make it a federal crime to host any ad that facilitates or promotes prostitution.
Of any kind.
Of any kind.
Okay.
Not sex trafficking, not forced prostitution, not minors, of any kind. Adult sex workers, anything, yeah. And
by hosting, this means like running a website in which people are paying advertising fees, or do they have to even be paying for it?
No. So that's by hosting. It means being any sort of online platform that facilitates content or communication. So Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, the comment section on Reason Magazine, email,
a lot
whatever.
Of sex work, solicitation going
Reddit, but any sort of forum. If they, Craigslist, Backpage, shut down now Backpage, but not just those sort of advertising forums. It can be, anything where someone is, it turns out, engaging in prostitution or is a victim of sex trafficking and is being advertised on the site, then you would be liable. And
is it like a misdemeanor?
No.
It's a felony, right? It's like a serious felony.
Yeah. It's a serious federal felony. And not only that, but it also carved a hole out of this thing, and we can talk more about this in a minute if you want to, but just for now, I carved out a hole in this law, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And so before this, you wouldn't states, prosecutors, and people with civil lawsuits couldn't go after these websites for this. Okay. So it would just be, it wasn't a federal crime before, but say it was. The federal government could only go after them. It also opens it up so that state prosecutors and anyone with a civil lawsuit can sue platforms for hosting an ad that leads to their prostitution. Not sex trafficking, prostitution. So under this, someone could go on a website, solicit someone for sex, meet them, have sex, get money, and then go and then sue Facebook or Twitter or whatever, sue that website in civil court for violating FOSTA, and you would be on the right side of the law. And also, every attorney general in every state could bring, a case against these platforms also.
Right. So, but this is something obviously that impacts basically every online platform, right?
Right. So, I mean, yeah. So that's what's bad for just at the extreme level. Like if we see that happening, and we haven't seen people doing that yet, I think we will definitely see that soon because attorney generals have just been like dying to prosecute people for online speech that encourages prostitution. But the thing we're seeing right now is that there's such huge penalties for this, and there's, such liability that they could face if they are hosting this content, that we've started to see people crack down on all sorts of speech, which is why, and it's hard to say exactly how much of any particular new policy is related to FOSTA. I mean, some of them directly are. It's hard to say on some of these more recent ones if it's because of FOSTA, it's because of corporate pressures, if it's because of, European data rules. I think there's different things, but Tumblr saying that no adult porn or adult sexual content could be on the site.
Right.
Facebook just put out crazy new sexual solicitation rules, which say even implicit sexual solicitation, not for commercial sex, just for like a hookup, is banned, and sexual slang and
consensual
all this stuff.
Ones even.
Yeah, consensual, non-paid, just normal people hook it up. And someone pointed out, like, this is the site that started off by saying you could put in your relationship, like, looking for whatever I can get. Like that would probably be in violation of Facebook's new new terms. So you're seeing all these. I mean, Craigslist shut down its casual encounters.
Craigslist is shut down on the personal stuff. You can't talk about it on Facebook. You can't transmit pornography on Tumblr anymore. Instagram probably.
There's just been so, and especially then when it comes to sites that were sex worker specific sites, and again, not necessarily talking about prostitution even, but sites where people are just doing erotic modeling, fetish modeling, sites where people are offering dominatrixes, which that's legal, doing a sort of BDSM thing as long as you're not engaging in sexual.
As long as there's no gratification.
Exactly.
Right.
But but because it's very, very. I mean, most people aren't online being like, hi, I'm good, because prostitution is still illegal in almost all parts of the United States. The ads are always a little coded for the most part anyway, so nobody's like, hi. So it's so hard for an ad to tell if someone's trying to, if they're trying to solicit prostitution, or if they're trying to just do some legal sex work, or if they're trying just to have a hookup or whatever. I mean, how is these content moderators that have, millions of posts per day through their services, they don't know, so they're just casting a huge net and just censoring all sorts of speech that's related. And you see even sex educators, like, people who are doing sex education or sex worker rights organizing, they've had a lot of their stuff get cooked off of Facebook and stuff like that. So, I mean, things not even related to,
Really?
Because, I mean, if you're promoting, so the sex worker rights groups usually promote decriminalization of prostitution, right?
Right.
If you're promoting prostitution, couldn't you be said to be promoting prostitution?
Yeah, I guess
which would be in violation of FOSTA.
Right.
I mean, I don't, I feel like that case would get thrown out, but I don't think it's above prosecutors to try and bring a case like that.
Right.
So
and so all these platforms are just beginning to take the easier approach. It's easier. Yeah. It's easier to ban all this kind of communication and messaging than it is to be like take a stand. and fight lawsuits that are going to involve lots of money and a lot of negative profiles. So it's interesting that we're seeing such a desanitization of the internet in general. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, I remember Telnet chat and stuff like that, and internet relay chat and stuff. I'm like an old man, and dialing up to chat where you could see one character at a time come across the screen. And I tell you what, like the very first thing that people did even back then was start hooking up and talking about sex and looking for relationships.
I remember men chatting me up in AOL chat rooms when I was like 13 all the time. People like to act like now there's this new sort of scary, dangerous thing too, where kids are being solicited more than ever before. And it's like, no, we just used to say, I think you teach your kids, like, report those people to the site, block them, tell me if anybody's bothering you, don't talk to them, but you don't tell them, like, you know what, we should probably remake the entire internet so that, like, kids can go unsupervised without any chance of an adult ever saying anything negative to them.
Right. Or without having any parenting to be done. I think there's some parental responsibility, to what your kids are, Right, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, the internet from day one was about sex and pornography, and now we're trying to, like, scrub it out of that completely. And that's, it's like a cultural thing, too. I mean, people seem to be really down on sex workers and prostitution and pornography and stuff right now. And
sex more broadly. I mean, even as the like liberal side of things tries to kind of pretend to be sex positive about a lot of things.
Negative.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, I mean, I'm thinking of a few years ago, this has kind of died down a little bit, but the whole like slut walk, the whole like,
Oh, yeah.
You'd see that, but then you also just see anything coming out of the mouths of these, or is just that sex is an inherently sort of traumatizing and negative experience. I mean, so it's, yeah.
Well, thank you, radical.
Dangerous.
Thank you, radical feminists. Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. The whole slut walk phenomenon has sort of evaporated, hasn't it? There's not really like a public push for like more sexual acceptance these days. It's actually the opposite, and that's sort of a manifestation of like kids these days aren't having as much sex. They're not drinking as much, or driving as much, or going on as many dates, or having as much fun, or going outside as much. They're just sitting in their bedrooms on their phone, getting depressed and anxious.
We're worried about them than ever before.
Well, I think that's a phenomenon that can be applied in a lot of scenarios where, like, the more equal a society becomes, then each instance of inequality gets amplified even more so.
Narcissism of small differences.
Yes.
It's one of the best theories. But groups that have so much in common tend to, fight or amplify the things that are the smalls.
And so we see that sort of in so many different circumstances. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that slut walk phenomenon. That's gone. That's gone. And if
you think, there was a lot of that.
You would feel it would feel out of context or slightly wrong or something if it happened again today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even
I was in grade school and junior high when the sort of 90s riot girl stuff was happening, that sort of wave of feminism. But, I remember like looking at like Bitch magazine and stuff, and there were always like, I used the like crocheted dildo covers. It was just like every other ad was for a crocheted dildo cover. But I feel like there was this version of sort of, and that's what I thought of as being third wave. The wave conversation is not very helpful because I think we all say different things. But, that's what I thought of as third wave feminists. The second was the 60s through the Andrea Dworkin porn wars. But now we had these people who were like interested in pop culture. They were, they were like, I can wear lipstick and dress slutty and it doesn't, or not even slutty, but I can dress pretty and care about my looks and it doesn't make me a bad feminist.
Right, exactly.
It was very emphasis on choice. So it was very positive towards sex workers, but it was also just very positive towards women owning their sexuality and, things like that. And I feel like even though it may be changed, it was sort of a steady trend in that direction in feminism until recently. And then it's just it's changed.
Yeah, I think
it's not very eloquent.
We're
I
like
don't really know how to describe it.
We're like careening wildly off my topic list, but this is awesome because this is actually very interesting. I think that part of the sort of anti-sex element within the feminist movement has been generated by their sort of battles over the trans issue, right? And like it's really put a big divider in that sort of radical gender feminist community of like who actually is even a man, who actually is even a woman. And if you're having sex with that person, are you reinforcing the patriarchy and you're not doing your duty as a feminist? I mean, I've gotten in a lot of trouble for talking about sex and feminism and whether or not feminists have like, sexual fantasies that veer towards, violent or dominating or whatever. Like I've dipped my toe in this conversation before. But it fascinates me to no end that I end up arguing on behalf of the rights of women to make their own choices.
Yeah. I mean, so that's what, and I know I'm veering off your topic list even further, but I should
Let's do it.
I should use this opportunity to plug. I started a group recently with a woman named Kat Murdy, and it's called Feminists for Liberty. And basically, our goal is to promote libertarian feminism because
libertarian feminism. There we go.
Yeah, and I discovered that. I just sort of discovered feminism around the same time I discovered libertarianism, and I've thought that there was never any conflict between them. I've been very, I've considered myself both for, over a decade now, or longer than that even. But I don't identify with many people in mainstream feminism. I think that right now there's just such a solution to identify problems that are real, but then reach for the wrong solutions to them. And then also the tendency, which is just very common in politics across the board, though, to then even exaggerate and, the bad statistics and that sort of stuff, the hyperbole in service of the solution to the problem, which is a bad solution anyways. So, I mean, I think that one of the things that I really try to do is focus on, you usually have people kind of being like, that's just a stupid issue, altogether the feminists are talking about, or like, here's the issue and you have to feel like this way about it, or that's it. So I think that, one of our things we're trying to do is try and not be negative about a lot of the things that are important to talk about, but try and encourage, non-state solutions, non sort of a intense authoritarianism, both from the state and at a cultural level,
I think the thing that always struck me about the evolution of feminism was that if to me, I always thought it was about celebrating female agency.
Yeah.
And the ability for women to that they have the capability to make their own choices. I mean, it seems absurd to even like lay it out like this. That they have the capability to make their own choices, and that they should be empowered to make those choices. And then there's like the third thing that people don't want to talk about, which is like, and then everybody has to live with their choices, right?
Yeah.
And that includes other women living with the choices that other women are making. And that's where I started to see this like inherent contradiction, this sort of like coerciveness that doesn't jive with some notion of like libertarian feminism, which I love that. I love that idea. And that's when I found myself like arguing on behalf of women's agency and women's rights against feminists, which to me is just a fascinating position to be in. So I like really indulged it and took it that far. But the fact that you have identified a need for something called libertarian feminism, I think that's fantastic. And like,
I mean, libertarian feminism has long roots.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of the classical liberal writers were, sort of the classical liberal tradition. There was a lot of feminist writers in that. They kind of went by the name until individualist feminists.
Got it.
That's what I would say. Until the 70s. There was a association of libertarian feminists founded in the 70s. So it's been a strain of, and I think a much bigger strain back a long time ago when there was less, talk about defining things. But there's always been this tension. If you look at any era of feminism, there's always been this tension between two sort of groups of feminism, and I can call it like individualist versus socialist or whatever. But I mean, whatever name they take, there's one who sort of wants women to be protected by either a state or, a bureaucracy, or thinks of women as a class that has sort of been historically downtrodden and then therefore needs extra protections or whatever. Or, and then there's a class that sort of says women should be equals under the law, and then that's it. Like, we don't want, and so that's obviously on the former side, or the equals under the law side, that we shouldn't be worrying about the equality of outcomes per se. We should be worried about treating men and women equal under the law. So
yeah,
I mean, this is a probably dumb phrase, but I'm going to test it on you. I've been recently. I heard someone say the thing recently about how feminism is the radical notion that women are people. That saying.
Yeah.
I think libertarian feminism is the radical notion that women are people who can think for themselves.
Right.
So.
Right. Exactly. And you when you laid out that first case and you said women looking to, like, it's like an appeal to an authority, right, to help sort of right the wrongs.
Right.
And I think that we're seeing that play out in sort of the on college campuses, where in the 60s and the 70s they wanted to get rid of the administration out of the dorm room and locos parentis, or whatever the phrase was, and they fought really hard to have the choice to do whatever they wanted, which really meant like fuck and drink and smoke weed and do whatever they wanted because they were free from their parents and they're adults now. And then now you've got bias response teams on campuses and the administration urging students to narc on each other, and every little slight and every little bias is reported to the administration. And I've learned a lot about this stuff through your colleague Robbie, what's his last name? Suave. Robbie Suave's work. I mean, he does great work on Title IX. I'll just plug that right now. And even in my own experience traveling to different college campuses, getting feedback from people, they're like, it's so crazy now, I won't even try to date somebody on campus, right? So it's like that feminist strain is like what has won out in terms of like the power wars, I think, of this appeal to authority kind of approach.
What's so like frustrating about it too is that, I mean, I get why people are angry sometimes. I don't mean all the time about all the reasons, right? But I do think that women have some damn good reasons to be angry about certain things.
Sure.
And I get why people are kind of, I understand the impulse, and not just for women in feminism, but to be like, we've been treated this way, so therefore we need to go and correct it. We need to have a corrective and overcorrect. But that inevitably comes back and harms, I think, the group that is more marginalized to begin with. Because when you're creating, I mean, A, there's a resentment factor, but I think B, when you're creating disparities between different sort of things and creating more regulations, like, power will always find a way to use it to perpetuate itself.
Correct.
And so, I mean, even and that could be in the form of, you know, being like, well, men are still more in charge, so they're going to end up finding ways to use it. But or like in the college thing, I mean, it doesn't have to be that, because it could be people that are in administration of colleges. They're just going to find a way to protect corporate interests and the PR of the school and stuff, right? They're never actually going to care about whatever social justice or feminist issue like the kids think that they're going to care about.
Right.
They're going to pretend to.
Right.
And so that's why it's just like appealing to a benevolent higher power, I think, to secure your equality is just always going to backfire.
Right. Right. Especially when we're going beyond equality of opportunity, which is, I think you could agree.
I mean, that's what they... I think they're not doing that. I think they would say that's what they're doing. Though. Like if you talk about the campus activists, they say that. And I think some of them actually believe that they are doing that.
Right.
But I don't know.
I don't know. When I went to the Kavanaugh protest at the Supreme Court on the day that he was sworn in, and I saw all of the campus rape reformer people there giving their speeches, telling lies about how 1 in 3 women on college campus. It's 1 in 3 now. The scare number used to be 1 in
5.
It was 1
years ago.
That's what I'm saying. It was 1 in 5.
Then it was 1 in 4.
And then it was 1 in 4. Now it's 1 in 3. And the executive director of End Rape on Campus was standing up there in front of like 2,000 people, screaming out that the 1 in 3 women will be a victim of sexual violence.
I used to write about this a lot when I first started at Reason 2, and then Robbie and I were both writing about this stuff, and then he ended up he was taking enough hate for that, and I was taking more like we were both writing about a lot of different sex issues, and it was just like we were getting hate for all of them. So it's like, all right, I'll take the hate for this one, you take the
right, nice, just divide it up.
But yes, I mean, I did a lot of research into those studies too, and they were all so ridiculous and flawed, and
right.
And also, again, one of the things that struck me the most reading those back in the day when they were always sort of publishing "Here are the real stories" on campus was the people didn't describe them often as sexual assault or rape. And
they're like self-reporting.
Right.
Yeah.
And they would even have the, quotes from college women saying, like, well, I didn't think of it like that. But the researchers then, I'm just thinking of this one in the Washington Post, which was, but I've seen a lot of them like this. And it was like, the researchers then, if they said, though, that a certain set of circumstances happen, drunkenness
like alcohol,
or whatever, or like they had felt uncomfortable and not wanted to, but didn't think they could say something, then they'd just code that as assault.
Right.
And
even if the respondent said it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, someone could be not saying something because they were literally feeling threatened, but like often if someone says, "Oh, I just felt uncomfortable," I mean, that's not what they mean. They mean that they just, for whatever reason, people are very uncomfortable in communicating in sex, and it's like instead of teaching. When I was reading those things, what I was struck by was that researchers and media were not respecting young women's agency when it came to them defining their own experiences.
Right.
But B, that there is obviously a lot of room among young people in general to teach them better sexual etiquette, to teach them how to better understand partners' cues, to better understand, and especially amongst these women, there's so many of them saying, "I just didn't know how to tell them no, so I just froze, or I didn't know what to say, I felt uncomfortable, so I just decided to do it, and then." Whatever. And it's like assertiveness, like young women, I mean, and I think probably always, but young women today still have such a problem with sexual assertiveness. And instead of focusing on why that is and how we can correct that, everyone's like, yep, you know what? We should just not expect them to say no then. And we'll just decide that that's rape if they thought that it was, I mean, that's literally what these things are doing. And it's
right.
mind-boggling.
So, let's dig down on that a little bit. Where do you think that this sense comes from that women shouldn't or can't or are incapable of being assertive in those kind of situations? And like, who benefits from that? And where's that coming from?
I don't know. Because, I don't understand. I mean, I think that it's one of those things sometimes where like there's a few bad examples that are real, and so people take those and try to shove that in. Like, obviously there are situations where someone has been too incapacitated, literally incapacitated, unconscious, drunk, and or was so traumatized because of previous whatever. And I mean, there are situations like that, and the person hasn't been in trouble, and I don't know.
So like the thing that comes to mind to me like is Louis C.K., right? Like he basically would just like whip his dick out and start jerking off in front of girls. But like they could have just gotten up and left. But then they didn't. They just sat there and then they blamed him for it later. I mean, sure, if you don't want to do that, don't say no, get up and leave. I mean, isn't it that easy? And I remember the Aziz Ansari thing too. And I kept thinking to myself that was a case in which the woman could have just gotten up and left.
Right.
But she didn't because she wanted it.
Well, I mean,
I
or
don't
maybe
mean she. I don't mean she wanted like the sex
right,
part.
but she wanted
to continue to be there. She wanted to.
She
see
wanted
how,
him to have a good impression of her. She wanted
Yeah.
him to act differently, and he wasn't acting differently. But
Right.
well, and I think, and this is again sort of one of the things where it's like, okay, how can we look at this in a way that is, constructive from a feminist point? Like, I look at this and I see not that it's just that women do have a problem with this assertiveness, and it's like, why? Yeah, why is that? Even in those situations, the comedians and the Aziz Ansari thing. Like, I mean, I think that yes, I tend to read this and I get so mad sometimes, and my first thing is just like, just freaking leave, just go.
Right.
But then you think about it and you're like, okay, I don't know all the circumstances, right? And so for whatever reason, if we assume these people are telling the truth, if we give them the benefit of the doubt, they did feel like, they say they really did feel like that. So why is that? Because even if they didn't in particular, some people really do. There are a lot of women, it seems nowadays, who really feel like just telling some man no is going to get them assaulted or killed or whatever. I mean, I think that I'm shocked how many people does seem to really believe this. So it's like, what is going on? And how do we solve that instead of just being like...
Right. Well, I think that the part of it is the hysteria, right? The hysteria around sex trafficking, the hysteria around rape numbers. It's the hysteria around all sex is about power. All sex could be rape. Like, I mean, even the most radical ones out there will say that all penetrative sex is rape. But, there's definitely...
But Andrea Dworkin never said that.
No, not Dworkin, but the crazies, and clearly that's not the case.
No, yeah, there's just a lot of fear. And I think that a lot of people are not bad who are spreading it. I think there are just a lot of average young women out there who are actually just are fucking scared because they are. But yeah, there's people who are concertedly making an effort to spread that, and that's the people who I think deserve the blame. And
Well, they'll say, well, men are much more likely to commit acts of violence. Well, yeah, no shit, because men and women are different, and men are aggressive. But that's not to say that in every situation in which a woman says no, that an assault is sure to follow immediately thereafter. I mean,
right, and that's what I think that some of this, this is so much fear mongering has convinced women that will happen, and so then you have them having sex that they don't want to have or staying in situations they don't want to have because they think it's going to get worse if they leave when really
and this
leave.
Is a great example of how misdirected rage and fear are actually creating more victims than they're actually helping.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a subject that I could talk about quite a bit. And I have, I started my writing definitely was around some of these subjects. But it's great to talk to somebody who has both a feminist perspective, a libertarian perspective, and, the experience in these sort of markets and information zones, as it were, to understand the history of what's been going on and to see it holistically without having a real tainted advocate's position, which is what you find. All these stats, all this information, it all comes from advocacy organizations that are dependent upon their funding, that is dependent upon people being afraid.
Yes, and I mean that's another thing with the sex trafficking stuff driving that panic too. I said the groups that were driving it at first. I think now it pretty much all comes down to money because there's been a whole industry built up of tons of nonprofits that are getting so much money. It almost exists exclusively on federal grants, contingent, and police forces that are getting the money contingent on either making arrests and calling them sex trafficking stings and sex trafficking arrests, or with, getting grants to create awareness about the problem. And the problem has to be getting bigger, or you have to be, in order to keep demanding money for awareness. So it's just,
Right. Every time I drive to Richmond or go down 95 and I stop, there's this rest stop, and you stop in there, and then above all the urinals in the men's bathroom are these signs that say signs that people are being sex trafficked. And I'll have you know, I think about you every time I see those signs. So I wanted to take this conversation and move it a little bit more forward and get into Section 230, social media, publisher versus platform. So just pretend for me that none of my listeners or me or I know anything about what 230 means, what a platform is, what a publisher is. And can you just walk us through that and then sort of set up the crisis that we're facing right now?
Yeah. So it was, it was part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. And it said that no internet service provider should be treated as the speaker or publisher of content created or posted by a third party, and unless they created that content. It's, the legalese surrounding it is sort of complicated, but basically what it's saying is that any sort of internet platform, and the words here are kind of hard to use too, right? Because it's like, what do you call Twitter, or what do you call different things?
Well, that's the crux of it all, isn't it?
Right. And I mean, I think of Reason. Reason is a publisher. Reason is literally a news outlet.
Right.
But we are protected by Section 230 in our comments. So let me just back up real quick. What Section 230 does, in effect, is says that any of these online platforms from, any sort of internet service provider, online messaging board, anything like that, that has user-generated content, cannot be found liable in state court or in civil cases for offenses that happen because their platform was open for that kind of speech.
Got it.
So if I posted something on Twitter and I was like, I am going to come and kill you, and then I got arrested for making true threats against you,
right.
Twitter couldn't be held responsible for that.
Right.
If I posted an ad on Craigslist and I was like, hey, you want to meet and hook up, and then I raped you, Craigslist wouldn't be held responsible for that, right?
Right.
So without this law, people who were, who facilitated the speech, there were sort of neutral facilitators of the speech that ended in criminal conduct, could be held liable. And you can see why that would prevent, pretty much any of the internet as we've known it today from having developed.
Right.
And it's been really, really essential for the building of the social internet, blogs, comment sections on things, everything like that has been really dependent on Section 230 existing. Two just quick notes on that is that it doesn't, one thing is that there are some exceptions, and it doesn't prevent people from liability for federal crimes. So, if a platform is, and there's special things for IP and pornography related crimes and child porn. So, you can't just host child porn and then be like, well, we didn't put it there. So, I mean, there's exceptions like that exist for federal crimes, but not for the state crimes and not for suing people in court. In civil lawsuits.
Okay.
That was kind of a convoluted way of describing it.
But what about, didn't we just say that the publishers or the platforms were now responsible for the sex trafficking stuff? Or?
Yes. Okay. So that was the first big carve out that we've had in this in a long time. And so they carved it out. So now, yes, you do not get Section 230 protections if you are hosting content that facilitates prostitution.
Okay, so I've got a blog, and in the comment section, two people solicit each other for some sort of sex transaction. I am now responsible for that.
Yes. And there are a lot of people who want to carve out other exceptions for various other things too. You've seen it, everything from... and we could talk maybe about the bias is a big one, but the ones I've seen on the sort of liberal side are people talking about, for people who facilitate gun crimes. If there's a mass shooter, if the mass shooter, posted anywhere on a message board beforehand about his gun collection or whatever, that you could hold the site liable. Hate speech is a big one. People want to carve out inspections for hate speech, and I hope people can't see, but I'm doing air quotes with my hands.
I'm always guilty of doing that. Air quotes while on the podcast. Does not work.
So they want to carve out these exceptions for that. And the other just really important thing to note about Section 232 is that it specifically states that good faith efforts to moderate content do not disqualify someone from Section 230 protections. So if you have, words that are banned on your site, or if you have terms of service that say this kind of content, you can pretty much pick any sort of terms of service you want and try to enforce them. And doing that and trying to filter out content that violates those, or trying to filter out content that is illegal, does not mean that just because you tried to, ban some of that content, and maybe you did ban some of it and failed to ban other parts of it just because that's the nature of processing.
There's so many.
Yeah. Then you aren't, suddenly liable.
Okay.
And that's the big understanding I think a lot of conservatives have right now with, calling out social media companies for bias. And so they've been saying, oh, we need to do something about this because they're acting like a publisher, not a platform, and they shouldn't be liable for Section 230 protection. But that's a very fundamental misunderstanding of how this works.
Yeah, so let's talk about that argument a little bit. So with the way that Twitter, let's use Gavin McInnes, for example. So Gavin McInnes has recently been banned from YouTube, which was his last social media account. He was banned from Twitter, banned from Instagram, Facebook. He's been basically wiped off the internet. He even got fired from his job at CRTV, and they took down his entire back catalog. Now that's a completely separate issue, right? That's like a private employer hiring somebody on a private basis. They can do whatever they want. It's wrong. It's stupid. I canceled my CRTV subscription because of it, but still. And so he's been banned, and there are people that would argue that he has been banned because he's saying a particular thing. And if he's saying a particular thing, and they're saying it's hate speech and whatever, and the Proud Boys are an extremist group, even though now the FBI came out and said that they are not classified as like an extremist or a hate group. But what people will argue is that by selectively kicking people off of their platforms, YouTube and Twitter are effectively pushing a certain kind of content while restricting a certain kind of content, and therefore have become publishers and not platforms.
Right.
Right. So what do you think about that?
Well, whether or not that is true, and that they are, I mean, I think it's definitely true that they have certain proclivities and certain, norms of speech that, yes, they respect, and they are not necessarily, equally applied. I don't think there's all of the bias that a lot of people say there are, but I think there are certain, different platforms have different norms of speech that they enforce in different ways. And so people saying that and pointing that out, sure. But that doesn't make them a publisher for the purposes of this law.
Okay.
Because like I said, actual magazines are protected by Section 230. Reason Magazine is protected.
Well,
for,
in
not
your
for,
comments.
Yeah, for our comments,
Yeah.
right? For our comments. So not for the actual stuff. But that's stuff that we,
Right.
the stuff that users, we're still talking about things that users post on Twitter.
Right.
It's not like Twitter created this certain sort of content and then said, this is content posted by users. So saying that they are allowing or not allowing a certain sort of speech, it doesn't matter for terms of Section 230 protections.
Got it.
It's a different issue. And I'm very sympathetic to, I hate, the sort of idea that we should deplatform people from all across all the social medias because we don't like what they're saying, I think that, I don't hardly agree with Gavin McInnes on much of anything, but I don't think that.
Oh, I think he's a libertarian too.
Maybe once upon a time. But that's a separate issue from the Section 230 thing, and that's what's so dangerous is that I think people have been trying to say like, well, now we need to, do something about Section 230 because it's allowing this to happen, and it's like, do you understand the alternative? Because it's horrible.
Right.
The alternative is that if the government has then the government has much more say over what anyone on any of these platforms can say. And so, I was trying to say, like, if conservatives think it's bad right now,
right.
that, private companies are, kicking off people for various things, like, imagine if the federal government is in charge, bureaucrats in the federal government are in charge of moderating content.
Right.
You're just going to have the same problem we talked about with FOSTA earlier, which is that there's just going to be almost no even second thought about whether we should allow anything that's reported. If something gets reported, they're gonna ban it.
Right.
They're gonna err on the side of harm. So I'm kind of mixing things because obviously the federal government's not going to be running Twitter directly.
Right.
But I'm just saying when you invite people to be able to prosecute websites for the way that they moderate content, then there's only going to be so much more content moderation.
Right. Well, I think the argument is actually maybe coming at it from a different perspective, which is they want to use the hammer of the 230 to force these like platforms into not moderating, right? Into leaving all
not
the
moderating at all.
Right. And because if you're moderating, you're modulating. Hey, I just made that up.
You're
You're
still
moderating,
allowed
you're
to moderate.
modulating, and then you're crafting a message.
But they specifically say you are allowed to moderate content without it because you can create a terms of service. These are private platforms. They're allowed
Right.
to craft a message. They're allowed to say only people. I blogged about this the other day, and I was like, if you wanted to, say we are a social platform, we're create a thing that's just like Twitter, but like only Amish redheads who are into BDSM and koalas can write here. Like they could do that.
Sounds like a party.
Yeah, and if you post about BDSM and Amish people, but like panda bears, they'd be like, no, off.
Right.
So,
Right, but would they be a platform or a publisher?
they would be a platform.
That would be a
You can
platform.
do that. Yeah,
Okay.
it's not about not being able to set rules. It's about who creates the content.
Okay. Interesting.
And so this is why the big thing with Backpage has been, a thing because they filtered out ads that said certain words.
Right. So this is a great segue. And let's just wrap a bow on this last one. The reason why I wanted you to bring this up is because I hang out with a lot of people on the right. who are very, I think, rightfully scared of being deplatformed. I suspect at some point I'm going to get kicked off of Twitter. I mean, if if they're even like looking at like your offline activities and looking at your past deleted posts and whatever, I mean, someday the hammer might come for me. But I hang out with a lot of people that are really concerned about that, and a lot of them are want to use this argument that Twitter, through their moderation and through their content sort of Overton window, I guess, not really, but they're the window that they're opening, it is becoming a publisher and therefore subject to all kinds of laws as a way to force them to not moderate content. You're saying that argument is just dead on arrival.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and you can look. I mean, there's been a bunch of people writing about this online in the past couple of weeks too, and people who are actually like First Amendment lawyers and stuff talking about this.
Right.
Popat Ken White is one of my favorites. Very libertarian-leaning former federal prosecutor.
Say his name again, please.
His name is Ken White. He
Ken
goes
White,
by
okay.
Popat on his
Popat,
blog
yeah, sure.
and on Twitter.
Yeah.
And and there's been people like him who have been going on about it. I mean, it's just it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how Section 230 works. And
Okay,
I think
good.
I don't mean to dismiss the problem that people are talking about, because I think like the way we are treating people on websites and the way we are sort of the mob sort of, you can, get kicked off for if people go after you, but they're not evenly enforced. I agree that things are not evenly enforced, but
right, yeah, sure.
Do not mess with Section 230 people.
Right. Yeah. And this is one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you, is I wanted to get that issue out there. And, I'm not coming at this from right or left perspective. I just want like accuracy.
Yeah.
The truth. And so I'm glad that we got that cleared up. So now we're going to continue building this conversation. We're building out to Backpage, right? And now Backpage contains all these things that we've been talking about.
Yes.
It contains sex workers. It has, solicitation issues. It has, quote, human trafficking issues. It has 230 issues. It has publisher platform issues. It has the big hand of the government coming and doing stuff. It's got all kinds of things going on. So can you like sort of cue this up for us and give us a little background on the Backpage, as it were?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, right now the two guys who are in charge of Backpage are in Arizona, in Maricopa County, with ankle monitors around, confined to the county, facing federal money laundering and conspiracy charges, and for facilitating prostitution. So just to say that common misunderstanding, people think that they have been or are charged with sex trafficking, and with they're not. They're charged for running this website that had online adult ads, including escort ads, including prostitution ads, and obviously sometimes ads for people who are, and I say obviously because just like on any site, it's impossible to get people to real ages, to get minors not to post on them unless you're requiring IDs. And even then, there's people who have fake IDs, so it's really impossible to completely filter out underage people posting.
So basically, they ran a newspaper, and in the
they ran like Craigslist.
Right.
People, I think, people, if they're not familiar with Backpage, most people know what Craigslist is, right? There's like all different categories, like for sale, help wanted, and one of them was adult. Got it.
Okay, so they didn't create any other content.
They didn't create any other content. Okay. So the guys who started it, I should back up to say about them that they started a alternative weekly newspaper in Phoenix in the 70s, and then went on to own like 20 of them, including the Village Voice and all over the country. So they were very, very libertarian leaning newspapers that were just, speaking truth to power, but not very, ideological, just, against government corruption in all the cities they were in. Very cool newspapers.
I was going to say, sounds cool to me.
Yeah. I got to read a bunch of them and read some of their stories, and it was just fascinating. But they, when the internet came, Craigslist. So a lot of their newspapers, like many free alternative papers, especially like in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, were supported by classified advertising in the back of the paper. And when Craigslist came along, it killed that. So they launched Backpage as an online competitor, just associated with their various sites. So it'd be the classified ad section of their newspapers online.
Got it.
And then eventually it became popular, so it started spreading to other cities where they didn't have newspapers, and then that became their sort of main thing. They ended up selling the company, the Village Voice company, and all the papers back in 2011, and just owning Backpage.
Okay.
So Backpage, itself did not publish any content. It was just an online classified. Anybody could create an account with either your email address or phone number, and then you post an ad for anything, including there were adult section ads, and that's what's drawn all the fire. the attorney generals, the state attorney generals, there's an association of them called NAG, the National Association Attorney Generals. And so NAG wanted Craigslist to shut down its adult ad section. And it pressured them, and it pressured them, and it pressured them. And finally, Craigslist caved after it got hauled into Congress and had to testify and all this stuff. And there was just federal pressure and state pressure, and it caved, and it closed it. And after that, they started going after Backpage.
And the Craigslist people shut down their adult services section.
Yes.
And their personal ads.
Yes,
right?
but they just shut down the personal ads last year.
Okay.
Or this year.
Oh, right. It was definitely in phases.
It was in FOSTA. Yeah. So they shut down the adult section back in 2009, I think.
Okay.
And after that, there are still adult ads on Craigslist, as anybody who looked could know. You just went over to the dating section or the personals, the casual encounter section. It was just
180 roses.
Yes, exactly.
It
didn't
not that I've
actually
ever
leave the
looked at
site.
them. I've never looked at them. Not ever.
But so a lot of the adult ad market also did go over to Backpage. So then the NAG started going after them and saying, you need to close your adult ads. You need to close your adult ads. And there's all these quotes from their lawyers at the time being like, look, we want to help stop bad stuff. We obviously want to help stop underage prostitution. We want to help stop, exploitation on our site. But this isn't going to do it.
Right.
Shutting down, even if you're against prostitution, this isn't going to stop it, because you can see the example of Craigslist. There has to be some other ways, and so they refused, and that really got a lot of people mad.
Right, but didn't the Backpage guys cooperate with law enforcement officials?
Yeah, so that's one of the things is that has ended up getting them in trouble too, and this is what's so sort of perverse about things is that they from that time they started really. They met every few months with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They answered. They said, I think something like 100 subpoenas a day from different law enforcement around the country. They worked very closely with the DOJ and the FBI. They let them post fake ads for stings to try and catch sex traffickers. They turned over, private, because they had the records, the credit card information. Well, first they were letting ads be free, but then they said, please charge for these ads because we want information. Oh. So they did.
Oh.
They started sending, they'd send all the information to the cops if they had a subpoena. And they'd also, anytime they suspected anyone of being under 21, their moderator would send that ad to the, block it and send it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So they very much helped. And they also banned a lot of words that were directly for illegal services, like, I want to have sex for money or something,
Right.
But also a lot of words they banned at the specific request of lawmakers and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It's so long to say. Because they were like, these ads indicate underage, and some of them were just sort of dumb, and I don't think they actually do, but they were just like, whatever, fine, we'll ban. Yeah, teen, exactly. Because a lot of, obviously all teens aren't underage, and a lot of sex workers use things like barely legal as marketing. It doesn't mean that they're, But so they banned.
Barely is still legal.
Right, it is still legal. So they banned all these words too, and all of these things prosecutors are now and have used against them. They said, oh, well, you started charging for ads because you want to profit off of child sex trafficking. And they're like, no, we started charging for ads because you literally told us to do that. They'll say, well, they let people write an ad that says this word that indicates child sex trafficking in it, and then they strip out the word, but they still let the ad go through. And so that shows that they actually want to hide child sex trafficking, because they would, strip out the word teen or whatever ad. And it's like, no, they just stripped out those words because
that's
told
what you
them.
wanted.
And, yeah, fine. If you think that word's, looks bad or whatever, so they would do these things, and pretty much every step they took to help, now they're trying to use against them, which is just, they started after there was a sheriff who got the credit cards to stop doing business with them, and they wouldn't. So then Visa and MasterCard and Amex wouldn't work with the site anymore. So then they started accepting Bitcoin for ads. And then they've been like, well, you only started accepting Bitcoin so that you could further try and facilitate illegal things. We started accepting Bitcoin because the sheriff threatened, and it went all the way through the federal court, and it was ruled unconstitutional that he did that, but it was too late. They'd already pulled all their business. So
what you've got is guys who own this newspaper. They're doing everything that they can to coordinate with law enforcement. They're letting people run stings. They're responding to subpoenas. They're transmitting information. They're basically doing everything that they can to prevent the sex trafficking from happening, things involving minors.
While still having a platform where people can, advertise
to consensual adults.
Sex work
and
legal sex work. And, obviously probably some that's not legal, but is consenting between adults.
Right. So nobody's being exploited per se in that case. So what do you think drove this prosecution of them, and what were the motivations, and who are the players in the bigger picture of what's going on here with these guys in the Backpage?
A couple of different things too. I mean, I think you just said sort of some of the general, all the, like we were talking about earlier, the sort of general hysteria around this issue, and they kept needing to find new targets. And like I said, the Association of Attorneys General, especially the guy who was in charge of it, was the Washington State one, and he'd made this his like signature issue. So he put a lot of effort going into Craigslist and put out all these press releases saying we're going to get him to do this, and then they did, and then he put all these things saying we got him to do that. So I think Backpage just pissed people off by not just doing what law enforcement said.
Right.
Like they just wouldn't do what they said, and they were like, if you would have just moved the adult section and let the other stuff happen, I think it probably would have been fine. But they were like, no. So then they really started going after it. And then you have people in the federal government who started sort of making it their signature issue too. And, Backpage presented a very good scapegoat for everything. So I think that you just had it become a very convenient target for something that people wanted to talk about. This is a really, really cynical part too, but there's a couple of people who are, in every single state and federal testimony about FOSTA, passing FOSTA, and about why Backpage needs to be shut down and all this stuff. You have these parents whose daughters ran away and ended up selling sex, and had ads on Craigslist and Backpage and other places. And then when they came, when police found their kids, police actually found the kids through, I think one of them was 15 and one of them was 16. They found them through Backpage ads that they had posted, and they were able to get their information through Backpage and find them and return them to their parents. And the parents sued Backpage, and they lost because of Section 230.
Okay.
And we've had various attorney generals try to sue Backpage too. And there's been, I want to say 10, maybe more cases in federal court, and in every single one, the judges said, like, look, they are protected from this because of Section 230. I mean, they did not, the ads did not say these were underage girls. The girls said that they were above age, things like that. So there was no way of knowing really, and so they were, not liable for it. And the people who actually were guilty of exploiting them, these girls had pimps, both of them, they were found guilty and went to prison. And so, like, there are people being punished for this.
Right.
And those people were found with the help of Backpage. But these people don't have a lot of money. These sort of petty pimps that were in this particular case, or in general, when I see these cases, they don't have deep pockets. These sort of guys who are hustling and, maybe have like two teen girls who are working for them. I mean, they're scum, and they also don't have a lot of money from being scum. And so they don't have a lot of payout for civil asset forfeiture purposes or for victims to get awarded in civil court.
Okay.
It has a lot of money. Backpage and other giant internet sites and tech giants. So I think the goal has been all along at some level for some groups to be able to, and you specifically have one of the moms who said this at the hearing in Congress, saying like, I lost my civil suit. They both lost civil suits against Backpage. I lost my civil suit, and like, I want to be able to get money from them.
Right.
And so there's just, I know she's hurt, and it's, had her daughter go through this and is looking for someone else to blame other than the actual person. But like, at a certain point, it also is just like, you can't, and that guy was supposed to pay like $5,000 and hasn't really paid very much of it. He's paid some, though. You can see that it's in the court thing. But, they were asking for like $1 million from Backpage. So I just think that there's a lot of that.
Right. You and I have had talks about this before the podcast, and the name Kamala Harris came up a couple times. Talk about her role in Backpage. Is my favorite person too, and I think that if she is seriously running for president, we have a moral obligation to talk about her as much as possible. So, what was her involvement in this whole shenanigans here?
Yeah, so she was one of the when she was Attorney General of California until 2016 or until 2017. She was one of the people who was very big on, with the other attorney generals, talking out about Backpage and saying, it's the world's largest online brothel and all this stuff, and we must shut it down. We must shut it down. She was one of the attorney generals that signed a letter asking Congress. This was back in 2013, I think, to get rid of Section 230 so that they could sue Backpage. That's specifically what it said. It was like, you've got to amend Section 230 so that we can sue Backpage. And Congress was like, no, we're not going to do that right now. And so then Kamala Harris brought charges against Backpage under the very theory that she knew it was illegal. She knew that the Constitution barred this because they'd already had these courts say that a bunch of times. And then she'd asked Congress to be like, can you change the law so that this is okay? They said no. And so she just did it anyways. So this was I think the first charges were in 2016. She brought money laundering and pimping charges, or assisted pimping charges, against the CEOs and the heads of Backpage. And
assisted pimping.
Yes. And because of the same thing, where there were ads for people who ended up, but not, Backpage had no knowledge of them, whatever, that kind of thing. So again, a judge threw the case out and said, no, this is unconstitutional. Like, you are not allowed to do this. And then this was right in 2016, right during the election. So she had them arrested right before she was, the election week, and she got her name in all the papers.
Wait. So she knew that something was against the law. She filed a lawsuit that she knew was unlawful, and then she arrested people for violating right before the election on the same very issue.
Kamala Harris takes down sex slavers and sex slavers. The country.
Oh God.
Yes.
Kamala Harris, everybody's favorite.
And then they threw the case out. Not much longer. By December, the judge threw the case out. December 27th, she's got like 3 days left as Attorney General of California. She brings more charges against them, pretty much the exact same charges, but like very slightly different, in another court.
She's relentless.
The judge has already thrown out the pimping and facilitating prostitution part of it. He did let the money laundering charge stand, the small one. So it was just like, but it was like, yes, she just was not gonna,
Didn't even care about the law. Yeah. Just wanted to make a name for herself. And, she made a name for herself during the Senate Judiciary hearings on Brett Kavanaugh. That's for sure. She was one of the...
She was there during the Backpage hearings in 2017, too. She'd just gotten to Congress. And
she's like the queen grandstander. And apparently you're telling me she's part of this NAGS organization, too. Or she was. So she's like Queen Nag on top of it.
Queen Nag, yes.
Queen Nag. Kamala Harris, Queen Nag. I just can't stand her.
That was one of many things that she was just so bad on when it came to criminal justice issues in California. And now she's trying to sort of remake herself as this, very, very enlightened, very progressive criminal justice reformer. And
she was anti-pot decriminalization also, wasn't she?
Yeah, I mean, she specifically was anti-pot decriminalization, anti-prostitution decrim. She specifically was anti-letting people out of jail or paying... what was the thing about... Oh, letting people out of jail early because we needed their labor in prison. It was like... You're literally advocating for slavery, but like, okay, let's go after Backpage and call them, slavers.
And I think this is what has disconnected so many people from the new progressive left within the Democratic Party, is that when I was younger, if you wanted to be in support of civil liberties, then you were a Democrat, right? If you wanted to support gay guys getting married or whatever, if you wanted to be against the drug war, if you wanted to be about freedom and liberty for yourself, that was like a Democrat's position. That's what I remember. But now that it seems like the far left progressive, and I don't want to get you in trouble for coming on my podcast, but I'm going to rant just a little bit. The far left progressives seem to be more about abdicating, curtailing civil liberties than sort of releasing them from the control of the government. And I think, for me personally, once gay marriage was off the table, and now that the pot decriminalization seems sort of relatively imminent in the next, 2 to 4 years, maybe federally, those social issues no longer like confined me to being a Democrat, and that sort of like allowed me to participate in new political coalitions. And there's just no way I could participate in a Democratic political coalition that includes somebody like Kamala Harris, who doesn't care about civil liberties, who doesn't care actually about following the law. It's all about grandstanding and pandering. And we're seeing more and more of that, I think.
Interestingly, this is where I tend to get along better, though, with socialists, than I do with like mainstream Democrats and progressives.
Okay.
Because at least most of the people who I know who are socialists, it's like we tend to disagree on economic issues, and that's not nothing. But like that's a political disagreement. It's not like whatever.
Right.
They tend to be less of the like, you're a bad person if you don't, if you don't say this or whatever. And they tend to, I mean, they hate Kamala Harris.
Right.
They tend to be very good on the civil liberties issues in a way that most of the Democrats and progressives aren't. So it's interesting because, yeah.
Right.
I feel like there's more sensibilities that are the same when it comes to them, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not talking about like, I know people just see like these protesters like out and they think of that, but like there's actually a really good like leftist contingent of criminal justice reformers who are not ridiculous and who are like actually you're able to build a coalition. Libertarians are able to build a coalition with them, I think.
Yeah. Well, I would love to see some element of criminal justice reform. I'd love to see some pot decriminalization. I'd love to see as truly a libertarian in many ways, I would love just to see less government involvement in as many things as possible. Just stay out of our way. And so I have one question on the my mind's a little bit scrambled on the FOSTA 230 publisher platform stuff. How did Backpage get caught up if the law was very clear and it said, as a platform, you're not responsible for the content of user-generated content? How did Backpage get caught up specifically?
Aha, I'm glad you asked. Not under having anything to do with Section 230 or FOSTA. They arrested the people at Backpage right around after when FOSTA passed. I think this was sort of intentional because they'd been saying we need FOSTA to go after Backpage. People had been saying, no, you don't. And, but a lot of lawmakers have been making that case. The Department of Justice was even like, don't pass this bill as is because it'll make it harder to prosecute. But there are people who had been doing a lot of grandstanding about it, both Republicans and Democrats. And they were like, no, we got to pass it. So, and the people from Backpage were arrested about a week later. So I think people think that it had to do with it. But the law hadn't even been signed by Trump yet when that happened. They were arrested on money laundering and conspiracy charges, which is what people have been going after prostitution for the longest time. I mean, if you think of actual, and I don't want to call them a prostitution ring, right? I mean, because this is very different with the but when you think of any sort of actual prostitution ring over time, or when you look at actually the 90s and when there were a lot of like call service, like escort services, that you would call into and stuff.
Yeah, in the yellow pages, man.
Yeah. I mean, they've always,
not that I ever looked it up.
Always gone after them under money laundering and conspiracy charges because pretty much money laundering is just like making a proceed from something illegal. So if sex work is criminalized and you're making money from sex work, then anything you do with that money, putting it at a bank, using it to buy more stuff for your business, like if you paid for advertising them to future your business, then you're money laundering. So that's what that's what they've got the Backpage people on, is just the charges that they've gone after people for this long time. Got it.
And has their case concluded, or were they convicted?
No. They're putting them through the ringer. They were like, let's go to trial. The Michael Lacey and Jim Larkin, the Backpage guys, and the
no settling, no plea deal.
Yeah, they don't want a plea deal, and they think that the prosecutors are trying to get them to accept a plea deal by dragging this out. They have the trial is not scheduled till 2020.
Okay.
And that was like right off the bat, the prosecutors were like, all right, here's your ankle. Well, first they didn't want to let him out on bail, but then they did. And they were like, here's your ankle monitors. You're not going to trial until 2020. In the meantime, they've been trying to take all their assets and get their lawyers disqualified.
Oh, nice.
So,
those are real heavy-handed tactics.
Yeah.
Right. Which you see, prosecutors do that all the time, especially the Trump Mueller thing. I mean, they're just grinding people down into dust.
I hate how the left or the liberals love not the left, the liberals and the Democrats love the FBI now too.
Right. All of a sudden,
just like, come on, guys.
Right. Just the day after the election, all of a sudden we love the cops.
This is what. Sorry, just can I interject?
Yeah, go for it.
This is what I wish we'd see less of from both sides, because I feel like it's just now. I'm getting old enough to watch it happen with either side. Just be like, whatever the other side is in power, it's like they just forget all the lessons that or when they're not in power, they just forget, and it's so.
Well, they're the opposition, so they use all the opposition tools that they have at hand, and it doesn't matter. It's not ideological. It's just like being opposed.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Elizabeth, we have covered so much ground here. We've had a lot. I
think we've solved all the problems of
I think so.
Feminism and criminal justice and
all at once.
Speech,
all wrapped up at once.
Just put us in charge. We promise we'll be benevolent.
Right, of course. Power will not corrupt me.
No,
not at all. We've known each other for a couple of years. We met at a press conference a couple of years ago, and we've stayed in touch. And I think that we've always sort of shared some similar sensibilities, especially when it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to female agency and independence. And, I would never recommend that my daughter go into prostitution, but if some woman out there decides that that's the best thing for her at that time, then I support that kind of decision.
Right.
And I think that we've also sort of always had like an appreciation for the overlap between sex and politics and stuff. And so it was really a pleasure for me to come down here to the Reason offices. I'm sitting, I'm going to take a picture of this thing so that I can post it with the blog post, but there's literally like half of a human body with like a Godzilla face.
Not a real human body.
Right.
It's a plastic human body.
With a half of a Godzilla face on it, and then he's wearing like a police uniform. And every so often I'm talking to Elizabeth here, and then I out of the corner of my eye, I see this like Godzilla.
I was just complaining about it before you got here. I was like, I really hate the Godzilla head on the mannequin. So the we filmed stuff in here for Reason TV, so there's a lot of props and costumes. But the mannequin it used to have legs. You can see they're over in the corner.
Oh, the other half of the body is in the corner.
It's had various costumes on, and this is by far the worst, I think.
I mean, it's really been distracting me. Whether
that's the table I was looking for earlier for you too.
well, we've done well here in the window bay, and we've got an hour and a half here of great discussion. We really worked through all the things I wanted to talk about in terms of sex work and freedom and liberty and the freedom of speech, publisher versus platform, Twitter and social media, censorship, and all the rest. I really appreciate you taking the time. It was really great.
Yes, this has been fun.
Where can people find your work? What's the best way to get in touch with you? What's the word?
You should visit reason.com to read my work and read Reason's work in general, because we're all about a lot of the things we're talking here today, just across the board.
Yep.
Yeah, Robbie Suave's work and just a lot of my colleagues writing on these issues.
Yep.
And you can find me on Twitter at @ENBrown. And if you want to get in contact with me, my contact info is on there. My DMs are open. I'll probably regret saying that. But and you should also follow Feminist Liberty on Twitter. And that's the Libertarian Feminist group I was telling you guys about.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
And I hope that we have a chance to continue this conversation in another few months when something else terrible, horrible happens.
Maybe I'm going to have to interview you next time for the Feminist for Liberty podcast. We're going to
I would love
be
to
working
do that.
on.
I'd be very happy to do that. Thanks very much for your time, and I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
All right. Thanks.
All right.